Okay, hello everybody. I'm so happy you're here. We have an awesome crew. I'm just thrilled that everybody could join today. This is going to be exciting. Not only exciting because I have phenomenal guests with me, but because I feel like interviewing the interviewers is like a different experience that I'm excited to sort of get into. So first, I just want to welcome everybody here today. So thank you all for joining. Welcome to the 5th installment of the Digital Campfire Download, the series where I talk to the creatives and the entrepreneurs who are building and stoking the world's most interesting digital campfires right now. I see a ton of new faces today, so welcome. A quick word on who I am and what this is for those of you who are just joining me for the first time. So I'm Sarah Wilson, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a digital strategist. I'm based in LA. What's a digital campfire, you may be wondering? That's my term for a type of online destination that's more intimate, more private, and more interactive than our public-facing social platforms. I launched the series to meet the creative and the entrepreneurial forces behind these hyper-engaged digital campfires with a goal to get inside them, to understand the strategies that make them tick, especially in this totally bananas time with so much uncertainty. If you want to learn how to create and grow a digital community for yourself, for your brand, ensure that yours continues to thrive in this weird environment and learn from the people who are actually building them successfully, you're in the right place. I couldn't be more thrilled to introduce my guest today, but first, just a quick bit of housekeeping for everyone here. So I've muted all of you, so if you can't talk, that's why, obviously, except for my wonderful guests. The conversation is going to run about 35 to 40 minutes, and you'll have the chance to ask questions at the end. I'll definitely call on you. Feel free to ask questions throughout the interview via the chat feature in Zoom. And when I open it up for questions at the end, I'll do my best to get to them. Or at the end, feel free to raise your hand via the little raised hand feature in Zoom, and I'll call on you. And you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. Come on in. Also note that this is going to be recorded and shared out afterwards. And a quick word, I was just talking to Kate about my extremely spotty internet this week. It's just decided to be spotty. So if this whole thing goes down, just come on back and I will do my very best to be here. But I guess that's just one of the perils of doing this from home. So now on to my guests. I remember the first time I heard the Forever35 podcast, probably about a year or so ago. I remember feeling as if I'd been teleported through some kind of serum-laced rabbit hole into a grown-up version of the best slumber party ever. I was getting to listen in on conversations between a couple of really good girlfriends about everything. Self-care topics were just the start. And in the way that those conversations between BFFs actually are, it was hilarious and silly and girly, yes, but it was also serious and raw and vulnerable. And I felt like the luckiest damn fly on the wall just to be there. Turns out I was not alone. A bunch of other people also felt that way. Some of you are here today, and those people, Forever 35's community, have helped it grow from a podcast into so much more. The Forever 35 community now has over 104 to be exact, hyper-specific Facebook groups, all completely organic and fan-led, which I learned, where listeners discuss everything from, dating to Disney to divorce and way beyond. Here with me today to give us a scoop on how they're building this community-first empire are the creative forces behind the Forever 35 podcast, co-host Doree and Kate Spencer. Please welcome them. This is where we have applause if you weren't all muted. Oh, I'll unmute you, Doree. You're muted. Can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Amazing. Yep. Welcome. I'm
Thanks
so
for
happy
having
to have
us.
you both. Yes, I'm so happy to have you both. This is truly like such an honor for you, for me, to have you come on here. So, not only do I feel lucky to have you on here, I feel lucky that you've carved out time. You're very busy. Like, I'm listening to all these podcasts. I'm seeing what's coming across here. For those of you who don't know who are here, you're putting out 2 episodes a week of Forever 35, a main episode and a mini episode. You also put out, until this week, you also put out a completely separate weekly podcast, quarantine specific, called Here For You, which you've done 44 episodes of. like casually.
Wow.
I noticed that. And then Doree, you also have a completely separate podcast you record called Matt and Doree's Excellent Adventure with your husband, Matt. So like just a few things going on.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Is this a full-time thing for you both? I mean, I think like we want to just break it down.
I would say it's semi full-time. It's my main source of income. But we both are also writers and we both are working on books. And so that also takes up a decent chunk of time.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. So just overview. The first thing you tell people on the pod is that you are not experts. I'm guessing you probably say that for legal reasons, maybe? Maybe. Well, the effect is that it's like totally disarming. Like you're actually, it's like in a world where everyone's trying to be an expert or a thought leader, we're just two friends who like to talk about serums and occasionally interview Madeleine Albright. It feels like that.
That was cool. Yeah, it was not intended for legal reasons. It is more legitimately just the truth, especially when we started Forever 35. You know, now we've done a lot of learning through our own research and communicating with listeners and the people we've interviewed. But especially when we started, we were really not experts about the kind of the topic of self-care and skincare other than beyond our own personal experiences. So that is why that is in there. That's why we did it originally.
Okay. And do you think it plays a role in why people connect to what you're doing and to you? We're not experts. We're sort of just like you.
I don't know if that opening line does, but I think that it's very clear that we are learning as we go, which is, I think, the bonding experience between ourselves and our listeners. Many of them, some of them are way more experienced in some of this stuff than we are. But yeah, I mean, I think it comes through in the fact that we have done a lot of learning in real time on the show.
Yeah, there's like a fundamental curiosity there that you're telegraphing every episode. Definitely.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it.
You started 2 years ago. Talk about how you got your first 100 listeners. For anyone out there starting something, whether it's a podcast or any kind of creative endeavor.
Well, I think it really helped that I already had a podcast. My husband and I had been doing our podcast for a little over a year when we launched Forever 35. So, you know, the way that most people find podcast discovery is led by hearing about podcasts on other podcasts. There have been lots of surveys and studies that have shown that time and time again. And so when I mentioned on Matt and Doree's Excellent Adventure that I was starting a new podcast with my friend Kate, I think that definitely like seeded our first few thousand listeners. But we also got some really important press very early on that I think really helped jumpstart things. We were mentioned on Cup of Joe, the website, which if you're not familiar with it, is a very popular kind of women's lifestyle blog, essentially. She's one of the OG bloggers, and her site is really widely read and kind of hits right in our demographic. And they posted about us really early. And so we got a lot of listeners, I think, from that.
Got it. Okay. So you're getting some press, you're getting some early traction. Was there a moment early on, and by early on, I mean like a year and a half ago, did you feel like, oh my God, we're onto something? This is catching fire?
Honestly, it was almost instantaneous.
It was the listener feedback blew my mind that people felt compelled to reach out and felt seen, and it was so unexpected, and that was incredibly validating and exciting.
I mean, one of the things that you talk about is how your community really, I mean, before it was even this community, it was just people reaching out and being really excited about what you were doing. And then since then, you've talked about how they really show up. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because obviously that's going to be the meat of what I want to ask you about.
Our listeners they show up for us, which is incredible. I had a little bit of a meltdown on a recent episode of Here for You, where I just had kind of hit my self-isolating wall during this experience. And the amount of listeners who just like checked in as friends it blew my mind. And it was so touching and gratifying and amazing. So there is that kind of relationship. And then we also see it in the way that they engage with each other, which is really cool, that we're not even involved in. We had a great listener email where a listener had posted in the Forever 35 Facebook group about losing ear pods, and then another listener brought them ear pods and just left them at their door. And there are things happening that do not involve us at all. And I think that's what's most interesting to me is the spirit of community that is just kind of existing alongside the podcast. And it's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that really distinguishes what you've built. I wonder for somebody trying to understand, like, how the hell do I do this? Is that something you intentionally nurtured from the start, or was it purely accidental? Like, tell me about that a little bit.
It definitely wasn't purely accidental. We launched the Facebook group pretty soon after our first episode as a place for our listeners to gather and talk amongst themselves in a safe space. And I think we spent a lot of time and put a lot of thought into what we wanted the Facebook group to be. You know, we've all had experiences with Facebook groups that just like go off the rails. And we didn't want that to happen. And so from the very beginning, we had rules about posting and kind of behavior in the group. Nothing too restrictive, but basically just like be kind. You know, don't attack other people, don't promote your MLM business, and like we'll all be good.
Right.
We had originally we had a woman who was a friend of ours who listened to the show, was our original moderator. And after a month or so, it got a little too overwhelming for her, and we brought on some more moderators. And now I think we have 12 mods and 2 admins who really kind of keep things going. We also turned on post moderation pretty early on, which was a controversial decision at the time. We had it was interesting. The group had only existed for a few months at that point, maybe 2 months. Okay. And we got comments of people being like, this is totally going to change the group. Like, I can't believe you're doing this. Of course it didn't. And I think it has actually helped keep the tone in there respectful. And so all of that was really important to me. Like, I wanted it to be a space. I mean, we wanted it to be a space where, again, like, people felt safe and could be honest with each other and supportive. And so I think for the most part, like 99% of the time, it is that. And when it's not that, the mods step in because they're on it.
And the mods are just totally volunteer who sprung up from the community. People who are doing this on their own time for fun because they're obsessed.
Yes.
Wow, what a testament.
Yeah, they're amazing. I know, they're amazing. And you know, because we have so many now, it's not like it's a full-time job for anyone to be a mod. I mean, I think most of them probably spend less than an hour a day, if that, kind of actively in the group. And we have them all over the world. So there is round-the-clock coverage.
Got it. Okay. So when you were thinking about, you know, how to shape this, why Facebook? Like, why did you decide on a Facebook group versus something else? I mean, not that there were a ton of choices, I feel like 2 years ago for stuff like this, but was it because you knew, you know, your listeners are already there? Like, what was it?
I mean, honestly, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head a bit. There were not a ton of options, and we've had the kind of ongoing conversation because people will reach out who aren't on Facebook who want to participate in this kind of community. And I totally understand why people are not on Facebook. There are many good reasons for that. But I do think, and the platform it provides in terms of being able to communicate, people having to use their real avatar for the most part, I think is really important because as someone who's worked in digital media for over a decade, you know, we've all been in comment sections and like there's a wild, wild west energy to commenting on the internet. So I know we do have a Reddit. There is a Reddit page, and our Instagram is also a very active spot for communication. But I think there was something that group setting provided, and also Doree and I are both in Facebook groups that we've had some go both ways, as she mentioned. So we've been in some, and I've moderated some that have gone off the rails, and then we're also in some that have really maintained a consistent space for sharing and community. And so I do think that potential is really there in Facebook groups.
Yeah. So for those of you on the call who don't know, the Facebook group now has about 18,000 people in it. And it's very active. That's the main group. But there's a lot of other groups as well. And as I said at the top, there's 104 right now, and they just seem to be popping up. What is it, like monthly? You get new groups?
Yeah, I mean, we have not been super restrictive about subgroups. As long as people agree to stick with our code of conduct from the main group, we're pretty open to kind of whatever people want to do. Which I think also, you know, we trust our listeners, and we trust our Facebook group members. And for the most part, they've proven that they are worthy of our trust. And so, you know, there is this kind of mutual appreciation and trust of each other. And I think that that's really important. So we have groups on everything from sexual health to listeners who don't have kids to listeners in Chicago. You know,
right. I saw there was one like Wisconsinites, like just people in Wisconsin. Like
it truly runs the gamut. And like every so often, what usually will happen is someone will pop up in the main group and say like, hey, I've been thinking about starting a subgroup about X. Is anyone interested? And if no one comments, then they're like, okay, not going to start this
not
group.
Interested.
But if a bunch of people are like, yeah, totally, I'd be down for this. And actually sometimes subgroups emerge out of subgroups.
So, right. Which is also, they're hyper specific, and they're hyper, almost like they're Reddit forums, like in and of themselves. Like, I need a natural skincare solution in Wisconsin. You know what I mean? You're just like, it's very, very specific. But it actually, that specificity actually does help a lot with focusing the group and, you know, making sure that it actually stays on topic. Although the topics do range. I have seen in some of the groups, you know, in the same way that your show kind of follows that wonderful thread of conversation, people revealing hyper personal details in a group that definitely doesn't have that topic at the top of it. So we'll definitely,
I just want to mention that the mod for our Chicago group is actually here.
Oh, welcome. That's awesome.
And yes, she
says we're called the turtlenecks for reasons I can't remember.
Maybe because it's cold in Chicago.
Yeah. Probs.
I don't know.
So can we just talk about logistics of the group for a sec? Because just for those who are really interested in starting these on their own, first of all, there's a password that you're required to enter, but it's not like a hard password. It's something. Tell me about that and that decision.
I mean, you would be surprised at how many people don't know it. We say it on every episode. Yeah, the password is serums, which is what we say in our intro of every episode. And when we shout out the Facebook group, we let people know that the password is serums. I think a lot of people have come to the group invited by friends, and they may have never heard the show before. So, which is amazing, but we are trying to have this one thing kind of uniting all the people in the group. So it is pretty basic in terms of like entry fee. Like, you just got to know that it's serums, and then welcome aboard.
I think a lot of podcasts or even any brand whatsoever would be like, we want all the people to join. And I see this in a couple of really smart groups, like the Ordinary skincare line does this as well. You have to answer a bunch of questions, and it's a higher barrier to entry. So it serves the dual purpose of creating a community in there that actually is who you want it to be, but also feels ultra special for being there. Even if it's a super simple question, they still feel special. Yeah.
One of the moderators just chimed in and said, as a Forever 35 moderator, it's surprising how many people don't get the right password. Yes. And it's fascinating what people put in too. It's also very fun to read what people put in, because
that would actually just be a great list, right?
It would, yeah.
Well, because also the group is closed, it's not secret. And so it often shows up as a recommended group for random people. And so we will get join requests from those people, or people who are like, this sounds like a fun group, just because it's been promoted to them on Facebook.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we want to be Big Tent, but also we felt like we don't want people kind of wandering in who don't know what we're about and what the values we espouse and the community that we have. And so, you know, as Kate said, it's not a high bar to entry, but,
but it's a
bar. Yes.
It's a bar. Totally. I think that's really smart. One thing I did wonder is, are the groups housed in a central location? Like, obviously, if you search Forever35, you'll find your Facebook group, you'll find some of the others, but like, I did not know about all of them until you shared like a list with me. And I just wondered, like, can you actually see them anywhere, or is it more you discover them?
It's in the main group in the announcements.
Oh, okay. I did not see that. Okay, got it.
So,
just wondered if that was like a strategy.
No, I mean, it's not public, but it's public within the 18,000 member Forever 35 group.
Okay.
And a lot of the subgroups have the setting on where if you're a member of the main group, you automatically get approved for a subgroup.
Okay.
Because sometimes the subgroups will get join requests from people who are not in the main group.
Okay.
And they do kind of want to keep things
tight
on people who are also in the main group.
That makes sense. For those on the talk or the call who don't know, the groups really range in size from thousands to a couple hundred. So, I mean, these are active in different ways, but it's really interesting to see that, you know, there's a ton of activity in those small groups. So were the groups at all, I mean, I know the main group was part of the plan, but were the subgroups at all, did they factor in the plan, or did they just start coming up organically?
You know, I think, and someone can probably correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the first one was the swap group. And that was a group, I think I started that group because we didn't want the main group to become overrun with people selling their makeup or skincare products that they didn't want, but we also thought it would be fun for listeners to be able to exchange that stuff amongst themselves.
Yeah.
So that was the first group that started, I believe. And then it just kind of took off from there. I mean, I think we thought like, oh, it'd be cool if there are subgroups, but it definitely wasn't something that we were trying to like seed.
Okay, got it.
I also think because they're organically started by someone who has the interest and the idea. So like our ideas for subgroups are limited to who we are and what we're interested in. So what's so amazing is that you have 18,000 people all together, and someone can create a space for something that they want to engage on. And and in that way, it feels so beyond, you know, it's that's what I think is so exciting about it to me as a participant.
Yeah, very much so. Well, one thing that I want to talk about a little bit is that, you know, the discussions in the groups really range from check out my new business to, you know, I need a vitamin C face cream to my kid is driving me nuts. But then there's also really, really vulnerable stuff. Like I have seen, you know, I think the other day somebody revealed that she had decided to leave her marriage and that this was something she was telling the group first. You know, that's a level of vulnerability that goes deep. And I wondered if you had a sense of like, what is it about you two, the brand you've created, or is it the forum of being in a Facebook group that really drives people to share with that level of vulnerability?
I think it's a combination. And I do think it goes back to what I was saying before about trust. You know, another one of our rules for the group is you can't share anything outside of the group. You can't share screenshots. You can't quote from something without people's permission.
I just shared the
no,
example.
I mean, that was,
okay.
but that
anonymous.
Was, you know, you're not like posting it on Twitter or something. And we've been pretty strict about that. So in that way, it is a safe space for people. And I think also, you know, what you were saying before, like Kate and I have both been very vulnerable on the podcast and talked about things that are intimate in every sense of the word. And I think in the Facebook group, it's been sort of a snowball effect where one person shares something very intimate, they get a lot of support from the community, and people say, okay, this is a place where I can go to get support. What's interesting too is sometimes someone will share something private and someone they know IRL chime in the comments and be like, oh, hey, like, I didn't know you were going through that. Like, let's catch up.
Right.
And so it's just an interesting kind of
dynamic.
Confidence.
It's interesting dynamic. You say that, because one thing I have noticed is that people often talk about, you know, people flocking to these smaller, more intimate forums, digital campfires, because of privacy. But actually, I wonder if it's a little more nuanced than that, because like, are these forums really more private? You're really with a bunch of strangers in the same way you would be on Facebook newsfeed, let's say. But it's more like the illusion of privacy and real trust engendered by being with your people, right? That comes from it. What's your take on that? Because it is so interesting and it totally plays into what you just said.
I'm thinking about this one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tricky because you're right. No space on the internet is truly private. And I've learned that lesson personally the hard way many times. And I'm watching as my children are on the verge of being about to start to learn that too, you know? So it is tricky. I don't know, Doree, do you have thoughts on it? I'm not sure I can articulate.
I do think there is an illusion of privacy, and sometimes I want to almost chime in and say to people like, hey, please remember there are 18,000 people in this group. And we are all just operating kind of on the honor system that people aren't going to share or talk about you. But like, we obviously can't guarantee that. And that is a peril of any group that becomes big. I think any group that goes beyond like 1,000 people, it, you know, you do have to kind of ask yourself before you post, like, okay, I'm sending this out to 18,000 people. I definitely, I think that's right. I just think I'm so curious because I'm in a lot of these Facebook groups, including yours. And it's very much the norm. When you have a group that's sharing it's like a shared purpose or a sense that you're with your peeps. These are my peeps. We like the same things, and it does engender that sense. And it's just so, to me, it's so key to actually creating a strong community that I'm just so interested, because we talk a lot about privacy as like people are craving privacy, they're going to smaller, but it's like, but are they, or do they just want to be with their people, like, and share that level of trust? There is something really rewarding when you post something really vulnerable, like I'm thinking about leaving my husband, and like 200 people comment and support you. You know, you're probably not going to get that in a group of 50 people. So, you know, I think there's kind of trade-offs in both directions. Yeah, very much so.
I also think it's the format of that, of how posting is presented. And I think it's actually similar to podcasting in a way. You know, like Doree said, we are very intimate with what we talk about on the show. And part of that is because it's just the two of us having a conversation. And then it gets uploaded, and you forget that thousands of people have now heard about, like, your hemorrhoids is the one that we've like we went deep on hemorrhoids and bidets, and like, you forget that anyone can hear that. And I think it's similar with the experience of writing a post, is that it often doesn't, it's not the same as sitting here in a Zoom or standing in front of a crowd or being in a circle of friends where being vulnerable is more, you can feel it more deeply and you can see the reaction or experience the reaction. You're able to kind of allow yourself to be a little bit more raw.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. What role do you think that the groups have played in really driving the success of the podcast and sort of the popularity overall?
What do you mean exactly?
Yeah, so I'm interested to know as these have proliferated, how does that feed back into?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I think so. I think it does. We don't have like hard numbers about that. And it's also not, we didn't start the Facebook group to grow the podcast. It was more like, if you listen to the podcast, we want you to have a place where you can talk to other listeners of the podcast. It's sort of like an added value of listening to the podcast. We don't monetize it. It's there for the listeners. And I think that, I think that there have been some people, and Kate, probably what you were saying, friends of people who are in the group who have found the podcast through the group. We do occasionally get people who say, like, I joined the Facebook group through a friend who maybe like told them the password.
Right.
And then they started listening to the podcast. So I think that does happen.
It's another
I don't think it's
discovery. It's another way to discover.
I don't think it's the norm, but I think it does happen.
And I also think there are people in the Facebook groups who don't listen to the podcast anymore. Like they're still there for the community that's existing in these groups, and they're not listening anymore. And that's also fine. Like I think that's also they are almost their own thing at this point. And that's what makes it so unique and interesting to me.
Totally. So I want to talk a little bit about what kind of pivots, changes that you made in light of everything that's going on now. You launched a new podcast, Here For You, which has, as of this week, been now folded back into the main podcast you just announced. Next week. Yes, of course. I'm like, time has no meaning anymore.
I know.
So. It doesn't to any of us.
At all. But I'm curious to know, like, first of all, can you explain a little about what that is for those who don't know? And what role did your community play in kind of informing that decision to do that?
Yeah, it's a daily podcast that we started, I would say about a week after we both started self-isolating. I think we started the week of March 22nd. It might be getting that wrong. And the idea was to kind of create just a very quick check-in podcast where we check in with each other. If listeners wrote in, we would check in with listeners. We talk about what's going on in the world. That it did not necessarily need to be related to news about COVID-19, but it's impacted our lives in so many ways that it's all relative. And it just turned into this. Oh, also I should add, we also wanted to kind of focus on a word. And then we also chose an activity, which as we kept going has gotten harder and harder, but but just to talk about another way of it was a way of thinking about either how we were feeling or how we wanted to kind of approach that day. And then having an activity is just a nice, like, here's one thing we could all do or all look at or all experience that grounds us or brings us a little bit of joy or information, but it's also a thing we're sharing together.
Yeah.
So the idea was really just to kind of have this daily space that played off of the tone of what we've already established with Forever35. And our mini episode with Forever35 is all listener feedback, questions, comments via voicemail and email. So we already have this great setup of communication. And so it just transferred really easily to Hear For You.
Yeah. And was that informed by anything that you were hearing from your people at the time? Or was it more like, oh my gosh, we just need to do this? Like, was it bubbling up?
Yes.
Like I think
there was I think people were expressing gratitude for Forever 35 during this time of stress, because one really lovely piece of positive feedback we've received over the years is that we're soothing, and our voices are soothing. Slash like leading into a parody of like the NPR parody from SNL, the sweaty balls people. But I think there is a comfort in escaping into something that's not relative exactly to what's the kind of trauma that's going on around all of us. So I think people were already maybe drawn or listening to the podcast for that, and we just thought this could be cool. Also, we were both at home. I'm going to only speak for myself and say that I was a spiraling mess. Doree, I'm sure you were calm.
Oh yeah. Cool and collected, totally.
But you know, we were both, and this is something we've talked about, but like, and Sarah, you and I were talking about this before we got started today, but the regular places we went for news, the daily places for news were then becoming major sources of stress. So it was, I think it was both an outlet for us and something we desired in a daily podcast, and also something I think we were getting feedback that yes, people wanted more of just like something a little calm for their day.
That makes a lot of sense. And one thing I've heard a lot of reports of during this whole period, the last couple of months, is that podcast listenership overall is down. And we had a conversation about this a couple days ago, and I asked you, and I'm curious to know, like, it doesn't sound like you've been affected at all.
You know, Forever 35 has been slightly down, but we suspect that is actually partly due to Here For You. That
just a lot of content.
It's a lot of content.
Yeah, a lot of
frankly. And so we think there are some listeners who have just decided to listen to the daily pod and, you know, table Forever 35 for now. But there are definitely people who listen to both. And Forever 35 isn't like drastically down, but it has dipped a little bit.
And for anyone listening, part of the reason for that, you know, we think is just because of the lack of commute times. I mean, for obvious reasons, you're at home. There's not that in-between space anymore. But, you know, a lot of the stuff that I've been reading and hearing is like massive dips. And it doesn't sound like that's what you've experienced at all. Plus you rolled out the separate podcast, which has a listenership. Can you share your numbers at all? Like, are you able to share like what
we have around 125,000 downloads a week on Forever 35.
Okay.
And so that's across 2 episodes.
Okay. That's amazing. And that's been consistent for at least the last several months, or?
Yeah.
Okay. That's amazing. So talk to me about monetization. Are you thinking about your community when you think through any path to monetization at all? Or is it more sort of like they're over here, we're going to just do that in the podcast? Like, how do you think about that?
Oh, I feel like we think about it. It's always a part of a huge part of the conversation, because you know, one choice that we have really actively made is not to make the podcast behind a paywall or make it subscription based. So we have ads on the podcast, and that's an active choice that we have made and can keep making. And we have had the conversations about the other options, and people have come to us about a variety of different ways to monetize that we have passed on, ultimately because we don't think it serves our listeners. It doesn't make it as accessible for everyone. And we like that anyone can listen to our show. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. A lot of times communities really think about MVPs, super fans, you know, and the best communities really come up with ways to value them. Is that something that you think about? Really valuing them, whether it's, you know, calling them out in the groups, or I don't know, creating events for them, whatever you might have planned in future.
It's tough. You know, we simultaneously do want to express our gratitude for the super fans and the you know, the people who have been with us for a long time and have been super supportive. At the same time, we don't want to create the appearance of like a caste system of listenership, that there's like this special group that like we talk to, and then there's everyone else. And I just think that when you start making those delineations, it does affect the broader community, and we kind of value that more, I think.
Yeah. And also now I feel like we've established how we have monetized our show. So to switch to to some sort of tier like that, I would feel if this was a show I was listening to, that would feel like such a very abrupt change. That it just doesn't, I don't know, it's not one that we have decided to go with yet. So
yeah, that makes sense. And I love how thoughtful and intentional you're being about all of this, because there is such like deep thinking, and it sounds like it puts the people who listen to you at the center of that conversation about how do we make sure we maintain that integrity. So it's and I think that speaks to a lot of the reason why you have the listenership you do. So I want to ask you about some of the challenges. Like, what have been some of the biggest challenges in building this? Maybe quarantine would be one of them. I don't know.
Well, we had just started talking about developing a live show when lockdown happened. We had been discussing trying to start doing some live shows in the fall. And that has obviously been
really sad.
That's been put on the way back burner. So that's a bummer. And live shows have been something that we've been talking about doing for a long time for various reasons, mostly due to me being pregnant and having a baby.
How dare you?
We were not able to do it. And then finally, I was like, okay, Henry's old enough. Like, I'm not pumping anymore, and we can like actually go on the road. And then lockdown was like, no, we have other ideas.
Like, definitely not.
So that's one thing. One challenge for us has been merch. We launched some merch in November, and it didn't really resonate. It's like we sold some, and merch had been something that neither of us felt particularly strongly about, but we kept getting requests from listeners, like, when are you guys going to start selling merch, blah, blah, blah. So we were like, okay, let's put together this merch store. And it didn't like really take off. And it was expensive for us because we were paying people to run the store. And then it just got to a point where, like, not only were we not even breaking even, but we were losing quite a bit of money. And so we closed the merch shop and decided, like, maybe we will relaunch this at some point in the future. We did learn a lot from that experience, for sure. But it wasn't, I think it was like, it wasn't the right products. And I think
maybe coming at it with a strategy of, like, maybe like ask your people what they would like, polling them. You had already done that.
We did.
That was one thing we learned, that what people say and what people actually spend money on are two very different things.
Or what they say they want and what they actually will buy is a very different thing. That's like market research 101, I guess. Like, I've made that mistake. Totally.
Yeah. So, I think we do want our listeners' input, but I think now we have learned that there's other factors we need to consider as well.
Very much so. So I want to encourage people to start popping questions into the chat. If you have a question and you want to come into the conversation, just use the little raise hand feature and I'll bring you in, like video and all. I'm gonna just ask one last question from me, is that, for someone starting a brand, whether it's a podcast or not, can you kind of tease out a few key things you would tell them about how to, like, build and maintain a community, drawing on what you've learned doing it for this? Like, what are your top three?
One thought I have is to focus. Don't spread yourself too thin in terms of developing communities across multiple platforms. Like, we don't worry too much about Twitter, and that's been, I don't think that's harmed us in a way. We still have Twitter page that we update that gets updated, I think automatically. I don't even know. That's how uninvolved I am with the Twitter. But we also did a newsletter for almost 2 years that had it was a huge undertaking, and it has a big had a big following, and it was very interactive, but it became between doing that and maintaining Instagram, doing the podcast, updating the website, and then having a Facebook community. It was just another thing. And we ended it in the fall. It just started to kind of like the click-through rate started to go down, and we weren't as invested. And so that was one thing we were able to take off our plate to give us more time to focus on other stuff. So I think worrying about all the ways, I think, can lead you to having no interaction or community. I think it's so much more effective, in my opinion, to laser focus on one or two spots. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So number one, laser focus. Don't try to spread yourself too thin. What's your second? I want to hear your number two. These are so good.
I think establishing boundaries from the beginning, and that goes back to something I was saying at the beginning of the conversation. We had very clear rules from the very beginning, and I do think that is really important. I think it's important to set the tone from the start and let people know that they're stepping into a space that has boundaries.
Isn't it the same with raising kids? I mean, am I right?
Totally.
Like, appreciate a good boundary. No, it's true. As you say that, I'm like, yeah, that actually applies to many aspects of life. That's okay. So number two is set really clear boundaries that kind of are an extension of the boundaries that you're setting within your thing that you're creating, whatever it is, your brand.
Yeah.
Or would you say there's a third? I love a threesome. I love a three.
I mean, I think putting your community first, and this can apply in so many ways, but just to apply it to something that we were just talking about, in terms of monetization, there are a lot of ways that we could have been making more money from our podcast and from our brand, but I think it would have affected our community. And so we made that conscious choice to not do that. And people know when you're like, when they feel used and when they feel like you're not being authentic. And we've just tried to be really, really intentional about that.
Yeah, I think it shows for sure. So there's a bunch of people in the chat. I don't know if you can see this, but Erica says, I remember enjoying the newsletter, but I totally didn't notice that it stopped. And then a bunch of other
Erica.
It was great, but yes, you don't need to do all the things, and I completely agree. So we have
the decision.
Right? I mean, we love that. So from Amanda, I'm just going to ask her question. Can you give an example of how a moderator successfully stepped in within the Facebook group to prevent it from going off the rails? I imagine the first time a moderator establishes a boundary, there can be friction. How did it go? What about a time that it didn't work? And by the way, there are a couple mods in this chat. If they're here still, feel free to raise your hand and I'll bring you into the chat via video if you want. Or Doree or Kate, just you can talk about it.
Well, I'm going through, because there have been a few, and I was trying to remember specifics. There was one that our head mod, Heather, brought to, like, we were talking about it about a month ago. That was about corona shaming. Someone had posted a link to an article, and then the conversation just sort of devolved, and a mod eventually stepped in and said, like, I'm closing comments now. And that is what usually happens. But there is a mod. Yeah. And okay, so Elizabeth says it's usually about approving posts that we think will be problematic rather than drama within published posts. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before about turning on post moderation. I do think the mods do an amazing job of catching things that, and a lot of times, I will say, it's about protecting the OP, protecting the original poster. Like when someone tries to post something that you kind of know going in is going to be a dog pile, or if they have an opinion that you're just like, ooh, and we don't want someone to feel like they're being attacked.
Right.
It's hard though, because like sometimes people do genuinely need advice, but you're just like, this is not going to go well for them.
Yeah. So it's more about heading it off at the pass rather than making a decision once you're in the fray.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Jenna has a great question. You both mentioned being vulnerable on the podcast. Is there anything you wish you hadn't shared looking back on it?
That is a good question. I wish I hadn't shared.
You're like literally nothing.
No, I think it's, I feel, you know what, actually, I do have something, which is that as my children recently, they're 9 and 7, and they were like, do you talk about us on your podcast? And I was like, yeah. And they were so upset. And, or my oldest was especially like, what? And I've realized like that has to stop, you know, like they are, one, I don't want to use my kids to create content, but two, like they're their own people, and they have a right to privacy and their own life experiences not being shared. So that's something that I am going to deliberately be holding back on. And I think that still means I can talk about my own experience as a parent and a mother and a partner, but not, and I try not to use their names, and I don't actually post them on my Instagram. I try to keep them out of it, but I'm gonna try a little harder.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that as you talk, because I grew up with a mom who is a writer and had a column and wrote about me a lot. And, you know, I actually, at the time, I wouldn't say I didn't like it. It was just sort of, it was cringy. But now I actually love having this record of this life experience. I was just thinking about that as you said it, because I think I definitely felt like, why are you writing about me? And it wasn't like crazy personal violation, but of privacy at all. But it was like teasing out life events, stuff like what you talk about on your podcast about your kids. And yeah, I think it's an interesting experience coming at it from the other side.
What has been interesting is that while in this quarantine experience, my children have started a podcast together. So
right.
And it's about their experience as
it's
children.
It's like apple does not fall from tree, right?
And it is fascinating, and they're producing it all themselves. They do it all by themselves, and it is like, you know, it gives them, they have a platform then to actually like share what they want and have their voice be what they want it to be. And that's been really sweet. That's been really cool.
I'm sure. Amanda has a question. Are you actively spending on advertising to acquire listeners, or focusing on organic word of mouth Facebook group referrals? Also, love that the kids did that. So wonderful.
We are not spending money on advertising. It's not totally clear to me what the ROI is on paid advertising in terms of acquiring listeners. We try to do as much cross promotion on podcasts as possible. So like we will do a host read ad for podcasts that we like, and you know, recommending it to our listeners, and then they'll do the same on their podcast for their listeners. And we find that those are pretty effective in terms of acquiring new listeners. And then also doing crossover episodes with other podcasters. We did a crossover episode with Fat Mascara, the beauty podcast. And I know we got a bunch of listeners from there, because, you know, people will often email us and say like, hey, I heard about you on Fat Mascara or wherever. And so we find that those avenues are more effective than paid advertising, although we've never really done paid advertising. So I could be completely wrong about this. It's also not really either of our areas of expertise. And so we would probably have to like bring someone else on, and like,
it's a production, and you seem to be doing okay without it.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up now. This has been a fabulous conversation. If anyone has any last questions, please feel free to put them in and I can ask them. But I feel like we've covered a ton of amazing territory. Is there anything else you want to add that I didn't touch on about any aspect of how you've built, what you've built, any aspect of kind of how you're thinking about the future?
No, you asked really great questions.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was easy. There was a lot to talk about, and I think what you're doing is really, really interesting. And I'm just so happy to have had this conversation. So thank you. Thank you, everybody who joined. Just seeing everyone's like all these new faces. Well, Zoom quote faces here has been wonderful. So be sure to check out the recording. Anyone who signed up to get this Zoom link will get the recording of this. And I'll probably do a recap of this episode as well, because there were so many good, like actionable, juicy takeaways. So stay tuned for that via email as well.
Sarah, can we send, is there a link we can send people if they weren't here today and they want to watch the recording?
Yes, okay. Absolutely. I will send that to you.
Okay,
and you can share it.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to have you. Have a great Friday of a long weekend, when weekends were a thing / they're a thing again.
3-day weekend.
All right. All right, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye.